planet's on fire. It's a real code red. Got us by the balls, we're being slowly bled. All the swollen puppet head, they propagandize big chocolate points, flat out lies. A house full of mirrors, it's a lousy reflection. Run hard left, it's a true direction. Democracy's in trouble, this news isn't fake. Everything we fought for is truly at stake. Border to border, coast to coast, it's time to cue the talent and meet our host. It's Podcast by George. All right, folks, it's showtime.
Hello. Hi. How are you? Welcome on in to another Podcast by George. We're on a live line again this morning on YouTube, and we're going to be talking about big news, a story that hasn't gotten enough coverage, I don't think. I mean, it almost can't get enough coverage because we're talking life and death here, and we're going to be talking with a new journalism hero of mine. We're going to meet and greet here very shortly. Madison McVan. She's an investigative reporter. You know, I came out of the world of journalism. I've got a journalism degree. I worked in the industry for a while. And to me, the creme de la creme really is an investigative reporter. I mean, that's what I always wanted to be. That's, what I hold the most high, investigative reporting. And by way of introduction, now we'll get to Madison shortly, but I want you to know that Madison McVan graduated from the University of Missouri in 2020 with degrees in journalism and Latin American studies. Before joining Investigative Midwest, she worked for the Columbia Missourian and Missouri Info Corps, covering topics including state and local government, meatpacking plants, that's what we're going to be talking about today, and the coronavirus pandemic. Now, she's fluent in Spanish and has published works in both Spanish and English. My God, I can barely speak English, but she can speak them both, folks. And she's originally from Texas. She's now based up in the Twin Cities. And, anytime I talk about or have reason to mention Columbia, Missouri, and the University of Missouri down there, I always think of my old buddy, my old pal, Larry Kotler. I've mentioned him briefly on the show before. You may have seen him in a staff photo that I shared with folks from WHO. That was his alma mater. That's where he graduated from. And, I talk about the big three on Podcast by George all the time: climate, war, and healthcare. And a lot of people, I think sometimes they don't connect the dots because maybe one of those three don't, connect with them directly, or they don't think that they do. But I got to tell you something, the situation with Larry Kotler connects with me directly because Larry was killed by the climate catastrophe. As far as I'm concerned, people now maybe are not remembering this. I don't know if Madison would be able to recall this, but Larry was on a city street here in Des Moines, 1,000-year flood. Horrific proportions came through the city. And Larry was in a minivan with his family coming back from a soccer game. And they were out of the van, swept him away. Larry died because of climate catastrophe. As far as I'm concerned, his wife barely survived. You may have seen that video or picture. My God, horrific. She was able to grab onto a small tree and survive. But Larry didn't. He didn't survive that. He didn't survive the climate catastrophe. Now, here's something else that people have not survived. Maybe you saw the reporting on this just this week. 1 million people now, as the U.S. mourns preventable losses among unvaccinated. A major regret: pandemic has killed more Americans than any war. I'm going to read this, folks, and get this up to where I can see it full screen. The U.S. remains the only one of the 25 wealthiest countries to not provide universal health care. And the healthcare system's focus on profits and not health has cost Americans their lives. Less than 5% of the world's population. The U.S. has had 25% of the world's confirmed cases and 20% of the deaths. This is from Public Citizens reporting here. This may be a couple years old, maybe a year old by now. But here's the thing. Before the pandemic, approximately 87 million Americans were uninsured or underinsured. About 1/3 of COVID deaths and 40% of infections were tied to a lack of insurance. Now, remember, I started off talking about the big three on Podcast by George: climate, war, and healthcare. Well, my God, folks, look at this. A third of COVID-19 deaths and 40% of infections were tied to a lack of insurance. What are we talking about here? Let's go back to the beginning. 1 million. So we're talking about 333,333. I mean, this is an unbelievable total. And it's because people didn't have health care. About half of Americans received their health care through their employer. More than 22 million Americans lost their job during the pandemic. Millions lost their health care just because of that. The U.S. remains the only one of the 25 wealthiest countries to not provide universal health care, and the healthcare system's focus on profits and not health has cost Americans their lives, despite having less than 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's cases. Okay, we covered that. Now, racial health disparities, including access to care, have led to disproportionate deaths in communities of color. We have the highest rate of unmet need of any comparably wealthy country, with 1/3 of Americans reporting that they or a family member has avoided going to the doctor when sick or injured in the past year. So, let's bring that home a little bit. I know 2 or 3 people personally that I know would be alive today, and they're not. They're dead, buried, and in the ground because they either didn't have access to the health care that would have saved them via insurance, or they have been so indoctrinated in not spending money on health care and staying home and taking risks that it cost them their lives. That's what happens in America. We do not understand in this country how significant health insurance is in our lives. It's kind of like the military industrial complex or something. It's so ingrained in America that we simply can't see it or can't recognize it. I tell people all the time that health insurance determines, number one, right off the top, if you're born. It ends up determining where you live. It ends up determining where you are employed. Ends up determining if you get married, if you have kids. And in the end analysis, as we were talking about there, it can determine where you die and if you die. And 333,333.333 Americans have died, according to that story. I mean, that is just jaw-dropping stuff, folks. I got to bring this up on screen. I want to get through this before we bring Madison on. Americans are significantly more likely to die of chronic respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, or cancer than people in comparably wealthy countries with universal health care systems, and a lack of essential funding led to insufficient hospital capacity. The U.S. had only around half the hospital beds per capita of peer nations and far fewer than countries like Japan or Germany at the onset of the pandemic. Thousands of deaths would have been avoided if Medicare for All had been in place prior to the COVID-19 crisis, highlighting the need to enact policy before the next pandemic hits. And it's coming, folks. Now, under Medicare for All, hospitals, particularly rural hospitals, and you've heard, Dr. Glenn Hurst on Podcast by George. He's been on and talked about this specifically, how this adversely affects, the rural hospitals in our country. They'd be able to get the funds they need from yearly budgets instead of relying on admission rates and elective procedures. Providers would better be able to coordinate patient care. No American would have to skip a doctor visit because of a cost or a lack of insurance, which, again, I know personally has happened to people that I know. And people of color would no longer face disproportionately high rates of uninsurance, reducing an important contributor to racial disparities and access to health care. Now, here again, I'm spending longer at the open here, but I don't talk about Medicare for All enough, and I'm just using the interview with Madison to kind of jump off on this a little bit. People will say, well, we can't afford it, including our current president of the United States will tell us that, folks. But here's what people don't understand or recognize. Medicare for All will cost less than our current system. A recent study by Yale epidemiologists found that Medicare for All would save around 68,000 lives a year while reducing U.S. healthcare spending by about 13%. Now, this is pre-pandemic. Medicare for all spending would be approximately $37.8 trillion between 2017 and 2026, according to that study by the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. That amounts to about $5 trillion in savings over that time. The savings would come from reducing administrative costs and allowing the government to negotiate prescription drug prices. Other studies by think tanks and government agencies have analyzed single-payer proposals at the state and federal levels. Most found Medicare for all would reduce our total health care spending. Now, get this. Even a study by the Koch-funded Mercatus Center, I think it's called, found that Medicare for all would save around $2 trillion over a 10-year period. So this goes on. I want to get this off because I want to get to Madison. But here's what I would say is don't be misled. Don't be confused by, oftentimes you'll hear this public option brought up, or it's not the same thing. Universal health care is what we're talking about. Medicare for all is what we're talking about. And we're sure as hell not talking about affordable health care. Whenever you hear these politicians talk about affordable health care, just remember that's what's affordable for one is not affordable for all. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about Medicare for all to start with. But not now. We're going to get to our guest. We're going to bring her on. Here she comes, folks. There she is. Let's bring her up full screen now. That's Madison McVan. So that was kind of a long-winded intro, Madison, but we're going to be talking about coronavirus today. We're going to be talking about these meat packing plants and some of your most recent reporting. And to kind of get you started here, I'm going to bring this up on screen. And let me go back to the beginning of this and show this from Investigate Midwest, the Midwest Center for Investigative Reporting. And I'm going to have a super up here during the show, Madison, telling everybody to go to investigatemidwest.org to check this out further. But there he is in the center of the screen. That's Donald Trump. I call him Captain Butt Crunch on the show, just so the people know I'm not a fan of Donald Trump because I criticize Democrats a lot because I'm trying to push them to the left. But Donald Trump is right at the center of this controversy. And the unbelievable part of this, and what your reporting is revealing, Madison, is that this executive order that Trump issued at the beginning of the pandemic was actually written, I think, verbatim almost, by TYSON Foods. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so going into this story, we had already reported that the lobbying group for meatpacking companies had provided a draft of this executive order that eventually was signed into law by President Trump. What we didn't know, and what we found out from this congressional report that was released last week, is that TYSON's legal department wrote the first draft. And also it was Smithfield CEO Ken Sullivan's proposal. So Ken Sullivan from Smithfield brought the idea to TYSON. TYSON had their lawyers write up a first draft. After some back and forth among the industry leaders and with players such as the American Farm Bureau, the North American Meat Institute, which is the lobbying organization, and some of the other large companies, they decided to float the idea of an executive order without initially sending a draft at first. And then, as the emails show, these companies and their lobbying group back-channeled this draft to get it into the hands of the USDA. And then from the USDA, it kind of made its way up the chain to the executive branch, where with some tweaks, the language isn't exactly the same, but you can definitely tell that a lot of the language was used. So I like to refer to it as kind of a first draft was written by TYSON. And what these emails show is really the details of how that came to be.
And of course, TYSON, everybody recognizes and knows that is the chicken producer, the big one in the United States. Now, Smithfield, what a lot of people don't realize about Smithfield, I'm not sure about TYSON. I don't know, I didn't look into who owns them, but Smithfield is Chinese owned. I mean, this isn't even an American family, folks. This isn't even an American company, and they're helping to write this legislation, these executive orders, TYSON was anyway, that ended up on the desk of Donald Trump, and then it gets released as an executive order from the presidency to these meat packers and their employees, almost verbatim. Now, here's the thing that I think of when I look at your story and your reporting here. These meatpacking employees, my God, these people that are doing that work, anybody that's ever been in and around a meatpacking plant, my family comes from a long line of people that worked at meatpacking companies, including my grandfather. My dad even worked in one for a short period of time. He couldn't take it. I mean, my God, he just couldn't take the workload, I don't think, but he also couldn't take what those people had to see and witness and put up with to do this type of meat packing work. Well, these folks are trying to do all the right things. I mean, they're trying to fulfill the American dream. They're going to work when they probably shouldn't have, working harder than almost any of us do. Here comes this executive order down from the president. And Madison, do you think any of those people knew that it was drafted by the company, by the people that run the show where they work? I mean,
when you
yeah.
talk to the workers, and after reporting, as part of reporting out the story, I reached out to unions and workers groups, and what they'll tell you is, we didn't know that this is what happened. Obviously, we didn't have proof. We didn't have the emails until now, but we suspected it. A lot of the things that were in this report, honestly, for example, you mentioned workers going to work when they probably should have stayed home. Maybe they had symptoms, maybe they'd been exposed, or someone in their household had COVID. Most people in those situations kept going to work because, you aren't getting days off if you've been exposed. If you have symptoms and you get a test, you probably have to work until you get test results back. And at this point in the pandemic, we didn't have rapid testing. It was a 3 to 5 business day wait for a PCR test result. And that person could be infectious during that time. And they might know that they're sick and they're infecting other people, but you're at risk at being punished or fired if you don't show up to work. And so part of what was happening at the CEO level and the lobbying level was that these meatpacking CEOs and their lobbying group were asking for messaging from USDA and from the executive branch of the government to try and get people to keep showing up to work. They were very concerned about worker absenteeism. And what you see in these emails is this repeated phrase: we're worried people aren't going to show up to work. We're worried about absenteeism. We're worried that people are going to stay home and try and collect unemployment instead of doing their jobs. And what you don't see in these emails is really concern for people who are having to go to work with symptoms while they're sick. Maybe they have a pre-existing condition and know that they could be exposed at work because of, how high the rate of spread was inside meatpacking plants.
Well, and again, the humanity. When that pandemic broke out, hell, I was afraid to go outdoors almost. I mean, I was hunkering down inside of my house. These people were going on the line at the meatpacking plants. And I know some of those people probably had to be doing it because they were afraid of losing their jobs, but also their company officials and the president told them they had to do it, and probably that it was safe to do so, or safe enough anyway. So let me go back through this reporting here. Now, a lot of this is what we talked about here. Now, the report compiled by the staff of the House Select Committee on the Coronavirus Crisis, released Thursday, this would have been a week or two ago, reveals that the country's largest meat companies coordinated with each other, and with political appointees at the federal agency charged with their regulation, the U.S. Department of Agriculture. That's what Maddie was talking about, to keep meatpacking companies operating at maximum capacity while thousands of workers were infected in the COVID-19 pandemic's early months. And she's a wordsmith. I mean, she's a writer. Every word here means something, folks. I bring this up all the time on my show, Maddie. We're talking about continuing to operate at maximum capacity. I mean, was that really necessary in a pandemic where people were getting sick and dying? Trump's agricultural secretary, Sonny Perdue, who personally lobbied other government officials to help plants open, is now the chancellor of the University System of Georgia. In a statement, the system said Chancellor Perdue is focused on his new position serving the students of Georgia. He ain't going to talk about this, folks. Let me tell you something. Look up Sonny Perdue on the web.
I've tried. I've reached out to him and his people, and there are several people in this story that we couldn't get to comment, and that's not for lack of trying. I can tell you that.
Yeah, and you want to talk about somebody that has his hand on the till, somebody that was caught with his fingers in the pie. It was Sonny Perdue. God, I don't know what he's doing now, but I'm glad he doesn't have anything to do with us, maybe at least. Now, I thought this quote was great. Dulcie Castaneda, again, apology for the name here, but a co-founder of Children of Smithfield in Crete, Nebraska, a group that has advocated for meatpacking workers' rights and protection during the pandemic, said the report is not surprising based on what she already knew about the lack of science-based coronavirus mitigation measures in meatpacking plants. Quote, this is from her, drafting its own executive order was a complete overreach of the private sector in convincing government officials to put profit over people, Castaneda said. The meatpacking industry disenfranchised the ability of public health departments and local governments to enforce public health measures inside the plants. These companies have more than animal blood on their hands, says Castaneda. They are also responsible for the loss of human lives as workers died on their clocks. My God, that just makes an old man like me weepy.
Yeah,
Maddie.
is there something I kind of want to touch on here, George? Yeah. You mentioned, I think it said maximum profitability.
Yeah.
And Dulce in her quote talked about this idea of profits over people. This was a really big debate, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, between workers' unions and workers' organizations and the companies themselves. I covered a lawsuit, I believe May or June of 2020, between workers at a Smithfield plant in Milan, Missouri, and the company. And essentially the workers were saying, they were asking for the line speed to be reduced. Part of the reason there were so many outbreaks is that people in meatpacking plants are standing shoulder to shoulder.
Yes.
They're working very quickly. And, one of the things I reported at the time about that Smithfield plant was that, you don't have time to step away to sneeze or to cough or, to clean your face off. And so the workers were saying, well, why don't we slow down the line speed so that we can spread out more, have fewer people. This would result in less profit for the company. This is less efficient. And the companies, fought that tooth and nail. They were able to get that lawsuit tossed out by the judge. And so that was definitely a big debate was, the companies would say, well, we physically can't social distance because we don't have enough room. Our plant is not set up to social distance. And so the workers' response to that was, well, why don't you slow down the line and have fewer people? And that was just never an option that was taken seriously by leaders of these companies.
Yeah, that's it. They're maybe not set up in their process that way, but they're definitely set up to be able to slow down, and they're set up to be able to have people not show up to work. And every person that isn't at work that's at home safe is another person that's not infected, and it's reducing the community spread. Maddie, I had on Laura Bellin from Bleeding Heartland just yesterday, and she was quick to point out a very important statistic, and that is contract tracing in Black Hawk County. That's up in Waterloo. That's where a big TYSON plant is, folks. They found that 90% of the early COVID cases could be traced back to that plant in Black Hawk County. That's how prevalent COVID was and how quickly and widely the virus spread coming out of one meatpacking plant. A huge super spreader. And again, among these lower income folks that are doing work that nobody else will do on a meatpacking line, the least among us that deserve, not the least, but economically perhaps, of, the working poor. A lot of people will call folks like that are doing this kind of work that deserved and needed our oversight and protection. And if you'll recall that photo that I had on Trump earlier, they didn't get it. And Trump colluding with the corporate hierarchy of TYSON to draft this executive order that Maddie has revealed.
Yeah. Now, can I say one more thing to that point? one of the topics contained in these new emails we got a hold of had to do with liability. So the executive order that was initially drafted by TYSON kind of had a dual purpose for them. One of those purposes was to protect the companies from liability for any COVID cases or deaths that occurred among their workers. The second purpose, as we've discussed, was to keep the plants open and running, ideally for the companies at maximum capacity. But that liability point, which, some of these emails discuss that they might not have had the legal standing to say that in an executive order. When we look at the court cases that have occurred, meatpacking workers suing their employers over contracting COVID, families of workers who died, suing the companies, saying that the company was responsible for exposing that person to COVID. I only know of one case. It was actually a workers' compensation case where the worker and his family, I believe the worker died, and no, he was alive, sorry. But he had gotten sick and he had missed work and had long COVID. And that was the only case I know of. It was in Texas, where he was able to prove that he definitely caught COVID in the plant. Because the companies have really lobbied to keep themselves from being liable for this. And then also scientifically, no epidemiologist is going to say with 100% certainty where someone caught the virus. It's just the nature of an airborne virus that you could be spending, 95% of your time in a really high exposure environment. But who's to say you didn't, catch it at the grocery store when you were wearing a mask and social distancing? With something like COVID, you just can't say for sure. And so the companies really use that to win these court cases. Essentially, they say, they weren't going to admit that there was higher spread, and then, kind of using this scientific uncertainty that comes with airborne viruses to protect themselves and say that, well, they could have caught it at home, they could have caught it at the grocery store. You can't blame that on us.
And it's, the almighty buck. I mean, it's the corporate capture of America. My God, Tyson Foods. It's just unbelievable to me that they're drafting basically executive orders. Because, Trump, he didn't know a Guernsey cow from an antelope, for God's sake. I mean, he couldn't be giving an executive order on anything to do with agriculture. I mean, this is a guy that's a grifter game show host from Jersey or New York City or whatever. But I'm not going to riff on.
I don't like to wade into the politics of it, but I think you make a point there, which is that the executive branch and the president and the vice president aren't experts on these issues, and so they're relying on USDA, they're relying on CDC, they're relying on these other agencies to kind of bring them the issues that matter, and they're relying on the USDA's position on this to direct where they go. And what our reporting shows is, there was the Undersecretary for Food Safety, Mindy Brashears, was kind of the point person within the USDA for the meat industry. She was offering her personal cell phone number, her personal email, and working with them through those means, which is potentially a violation of federal records law. It was kind of through these channels that the executive order was pushed up. I think when you look at it like that, it's of course the executive branch isn't going to be experts on all these things, and so it's really the people, the political appointees in these departments that were doing a lot of the channeling things upstream.
And you hear Maddie talking about all these details, folks. That's what an investigative reporter does. I mean, this is the kind of information that she's bringing forward, digging this stuff out and presenting it to folks. And again, I want to encourage everybody, go to investigatemidwest.org and check out her writings and check out the website to get more of this stuff. Madison McVan, an investigative reporter on our podcast today. I wanted to bring this up and see if I can get this to come up on the screen here. Make sure I'm hitting the right button. Now, this was written by one of your coworkers, I believe, Maddie. And again, this is on the website, COVID-19 and meatpacking. Well, I can't get any worse. Well, yeah, COVID-19 cases, deaths in the meatpacking industry were much higher than previously known. This congressional investigation is showing us The Select Committee on the Coronavirus Crisis obtained data on COVID-19 cases and deaths from just 5 largest meatpacking companies in the country. The new data shows cases and deaths were much higher than any previous tally for the industry. Combining the subcommittee's data with Investigate Midwest tracking shows that across the industry, about 86,000 workers tested positive during the pandemic, and that 423 died. And I don't know, Maddie, is that the static number? Is that number going up? Is it getting even worse, or is that pretty much where it sits right now?
What I'll say is that that's our best guess. With our tracking, my editor, Sky Chatty, was, I believe, the person who wrote that story, and he took the lead on our tracking. Because in the early days of the pandemic, nobody was keeping track of this, at least at the government level, and on a public level. And so we and a couple of other news organizations took it upon ourselves to go through news reports, go through obituaries, really anything that would indicate to us how many people were getting sick and how many people were dying. And so this congressional report, it's the same committee who put out this report on Thursday, released one in October of 2021. That was that story you just referenced, George, showing that, that was our most accurate and our highest tally to date. But who's to say that there aren't more deaths going uncounted, more cases we don't know about? Because as you mentioned earlier, the contact tracing and the documentation just wasn't there. And we've seen cases, there are some mentioned in this report, of companies purposely misleading public health officials on how many deaths have occurred. We can speculate all we want about how many people may have actually died, but we do know that, it's in the hundreds and the illnesses are in the tens of thousands. And, as you mentioned earlier, with these plants becoming hotspots, it's not just the people that are inside the plant who are affected by this. It's their families, it's their roommates, their friends, the people that were just in the community coming into contact with them. So it's really hard as a reporter to quantify, what the total effect was of all of this. And as you got later into the pandemic, meatpacking plants were hit first, but then it did kind of become more of a community spread after the, first wave had passed through.
Yeah.
It was never static. As we've seen throughout the past 2 years, there are ebbs and flows. So while meatpacking plants kind of peaked first in the case numbers, we then kind of saw it drop off and the community levels rise. And we've seen that fluctuate throughout the pandemic.
Well, Madison's not the only one reporting on this. This has also hit some of the pages of the Washington Post. I wanted to bring up a little about a bit of what they're saying here. Now this, let's see, I got to go back to the beginning here. They're reporting that an estimated 334,000 coronavirus cases nationwide have been tied to meatpacking plants, resulting in more than $11 billion in economic damage, according to research from the University of California at Davis. Researchers found that per capita infection rates in counties that house beef and pork producing facilities were twice as high. In counties with chicken processing facilities, the transmission rate was 20% higher. Now, here's the thing that I wanted to get to, Maddie. I suppose you encountered this too. This is our quote. This is from the John H. TYSON, the chairman of TYSON's board. This is what this guy was saying. The food supply chain is breaking. Now, that was in a full-page newspaper ad that ran in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Arkansas Democrat Gazette in April 2020, because TYSON may be a player here in Iowa, but man, down in Arkansas, it's huge. He says, we have a responsibility to feed our country in that ad. It is as essential as healthcare. This is a challenge that should not be ignored. Our plants must remain operational so that we can supply food to our families in America. I don't know. That's definitely an overreach, and I would call it a lie. Where do you think that falls? Was the supply chain breaking? Was it ever in danger of collapsing, Maddie?
It wasn't really, is at least what this report shows. And I had done some analysis previously before this report came out, showing that exports of meat products actually increased in the early months of the pandemic. And we also knew that cold storage, meat that's sitting in freezers around the country, was plenty to feed the country for a while. Of course, everyone knows we had supply chain issues. We had issues with transportation. We had, workers who were missing work because they were sick or contact traced and quarantined. So I don't think anybody is going to say that there weren't supply chain issues, but I think the possibility of like a catastrophic meat shortage, which is what some of the meatpacking CEOs, specifically at Smithfield, and you had the quote from TYSON up there.
Yeah.
That was definitely overblown. And in these emails, it's funny, you can see some of the companies who knew it was overblown were a little ticked off that their fellow CEOs were pushing this idea of a shortage when other people in the industry knew that there wasn't going to be one. And this is kind of funny because the Washington Post, I think, led with these false claims of a meat shortage as their headline for this story.
Yeah.
We led it with TYSON wrote the executive order, because in these reports there's so many news items. And like I said, I had done some analysis of this before. I think I've been covering this issue for a couple of years, and so I already knew that this claim of a shortage was false. Of course, these emails show new details, which are super valuable. But I think it just speaks to the value of having a wide range of news organizations to choose from. Everyone's bringing their own news judgment to issues. I read the report and Washington Post read the report, and we came out with different ideas of what should be the headline, just based on who our audience is or what our previous coverage is, et cetera. So
yeah, thanks.
I just wanted to point that out.
Well, yeah, I'm no fan of the Washington Post. I've talked about it on this show a lot, with the exception of the Afghanistan papers. I mean, the Washington Post, owned by Jeff Bezos, who is deeply entrenched in the military-industrial complex. People don't realize that. I don't want to get all conspiratorial on folks, but they provide computing space to the CIA and to the government in the tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. And that again, I'm no big fan of the Washington Post, but let me bring this back up. I want to continue.
I will say, their meatpacking reporting has been really great throughout the pandemic. They have been on top of some of these things as well. And I did it, like I said, we approached it with kind of different news judgments based on where we're at, but I don't think it necessarily, at least on this topic, makes it any less valuable. Headlines
are all important. I want to continue with their reporting now. What they said, a group of 4 of the country's biggest meat processors, including TYSON and JBS USA, collectively increased their profits 120% compared with before the pandemic. Net income spiked 500%. So going back to that TYSON comment, those dudes weren't concerned about the food chain breaking down. They were concerned about their shareholders breaking down. That's what I think. I mean, they could see people creeping towards the window ledge with stock prices possibly declining if there were slowdowns or people staying home to be safe. And that's what they were trying to prevent. My opinion only, but that's the way that I look at it. Quote, some claim that meat processors are forced to raise prices to the level they are now because of increasing input costs, things like the cost of labor or transportation. But their own earnings data and statements contradict that claim, the briefing read, noting that their profit margins have skyrocketed since the pandemic. We're not just talking about going up, we're talking about skyrocketing. These people made tons, wads of money more than they used to. And again, there are people that are not on the line at these meatpacking plants today because they're sick or God, they died.
Yeah, I actually just checked my inbox because I saw a ping while we've been on this call that TYSON stock rose today, outperforming the market. So we've seen that consistently. It's true that input costs are rising. But it seems based on their stock performance, like you said, that their profits are exceeding those rising input costs.
Subsidized by all of us, by the government, by taxpayers. I mean, my God, they're winning they're at a table that they can't lose at. If this were Las Vegas, I mean, they're guaranteed the win. The United States government props them up with these huge subsidies and bailout programs, and we're all supporting that. And then they do something like this, which makes me, mad and sad, I guess. Well, that's, I think the end of the slide decks that I had, the topics that I wanted to cover here that I had pulled to show folks today, Maddie. Anything else here as we begin to wrap up this reporting? Is there another shoe to drop? Is there more to come from this, or what's coming next?
Yeah, so this House subcommittee on the coronavirus crisis is still investigating the meatpacking company's response to the pandemic. I know that JBS is still procuring documents for them. So the committee hasn't, um, gotten a hold of all the documents that they want. So we can expect that there will be more coming. And then just the last thing I wanted to say, this story is very focused on lobbying and the federal government's actions and CEOs. It's not super focused on the workers. And even though, not every story has to be about everything, just wanted to call out, like you mentioned, these are people who are just trying to do their jobs. The meatpacking industry is primarily staffed by people who are immigrants, by people of color. I speak Spanish, and so a lot of the people I interview are Spanish speaking, but there is such a wide range of people, people from Sudan, people from Vietnam or Laos or Thailand, from Central America, people who speak indigenous languages from the Americas. So it was a very complicated public health problem. There were lots of people who probably felt very stuck, very unheard, who had no access to information about what was going on. And people who died. And, I've spent time talking to families of people who died, talking to people who were sick and, disabled after this, or people who were fired from their jobs because they got sick and couldn't come to work. So I just never want to lose sight of like who's actually impacted by this and what these decisions mean for the everyday people who go to these jobs.
Ah, that's great. I'm glad that you took that as your closing comments here for this Liveline, Madison, because again, these are people that, I mean, they just want to be a fabric of society. They just want to work. They're willing to work hard. And this is what happened. And again, I want to emphasize that this story really jumped out at me because it was jaw-dropping. It's shocking. It's great writing, great stuff. You can get it at investigatemidwest.org. Follow Maddie on Twitter. And I had that URL up earlier, and you can get more of this type of great reporting. I also want to emphasize the fact that companies writing legislation, this corporatocracy that we live in, this corporate catcher, that's not unheard of. Companies and organizations, that ALEC group, the American Legislative Exchange Council, they write, a lot of legislation, particularly down on the local level, because legislators don't have the wherewithal or the resources to write bills. They write them for them. There's something called the State Policy Network, Americans for Prosperity. That's that Charles and David Koch thing. One of those guys is dead now, but I mean, they write a lot of legislation. That's what they're doing. The liberals have a little bit of that. A State Innovation Exchange, or SIX, it's called SIX. They also provide legislation that they write that oftentimes ends up being debated upon and voted upon verbatim, like this executive order to Trump was. So this is all part of a much larger problem in this country, folks. And I hope we've shined a little bit of light on that with our help from Madison McVan, our new friend, our new journalism hero on the Podcast by George Liveline. Maddie, thanks again for coming on Podcast by George.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
We'll have her back. I got a feeling. I mean, she's just starting out, folks. I mean, she's just on her way here as a reporter is concerned. I mean, she graduated from college not that long ago, and this is already a great story, a blockbuster. You're going to be seeing and hearing more from Madison McVan. And folks, if you would like to see or hear more from Podcast by George, my closing comments are always the same. Go to podcastbygeorge.com and sign up. Pick one of those little badges, one of the icons that you see there at the top of the page, and you can get each and every episode. You'll be notified when they release live on Podcast by George on Facebook and also on YouTube, like it is today. And so you can watch them live, comment, ask questions. And of course, you can also sign up for the audio, the rebroadcasts that are on places like Spotify, the iHeartRadio app, iTunes, Stitcher, places like that, any place that podcasts are heard. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another Podcast by George Liveline.